Hi everyone, I wanted to spend a little bit of time this week talking about accommodations and modifications and how the use of those can help provide that inclusive environment for students with disabilities. So first off, what does the law say? As you probably know, there's federal and state laws and regulations that require schools to provide these accommodations and modifications to ensure that students with disabilities can participate in the classroom and at school just like their peers, so that they have access to that appropriate educational program. So there's three main laws. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, or sometimes we call it IDEIA. The most recent amendment to that was in 2004. Section 504, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the two laws that relate to accommodations and modifications are mostly going to be those first two. So if a student has a disability that's falls into one of the categories as per IDEA, they will have an IEP. And in that IEP, that IEP is going to determine what the goals for that student for the year, and they're also going to talk about the services, but it's also going to talk about the accommodations and modifications necessary in order for that student to access that curriculum. And that can be many different things, and it's very individualized. Section 504 in some ways is very similar, but it doesn't have that level of detail that an IEP does. So a Section 504 plan is going to be, for instance, a couple of my kids had gone to private school for a while, and kids in private school, for instance, can have a Section 504 plan. And the 504 plan is really mostly focused on those accommodations that can be provided to students with disabilities, even if they don't have an IEP. So it's not going to provide those services necessarily, but it's going to provide those accommodations so that they have access to that curriculum in the classroom with their peers. So accommodations are those teaching supports and services that the student may require in order to successfully demonstrate learning. So the thing that it's important to understand is those accommodations are not going to change the expectations of that student in order to access that curriculum at that same level, but it's going to change how they access that curriculum. So it might be different. If a student is visually impaired, they may need Braille. Some students may prefer do better with typing over handwritten, or maybe they would do testing orally and not handwritten, or maybe they'll require a quiet environment in order to take testing, additional time for testing. Those are all examples. So this is just a review of what I was just talking about. So it's changes in how a student accesses that information, but not what they access. And it doesn't substantially change the level, content, or standard of that curriculum. And the purpose of all this is to provide that equal access to learning and equal opportunity for that student so that they can participate in the classroom like their peers. So accommodations are for students with a disability who have either an IEP or a 504 plan. So that students with a disability without a disability who have barriers to learning, students who receive ELL services, and students who are at risk of failure. So a lot of times teachers will put those accommodations in place, either formally or informally. I've had it happen where one of my kids wasn't diagnosed with a learning disability yet, but the teacher, noticed that something was going on in the classroom and went ahead and put a student support plan in place to put those accommodations. Talked with me. We met informally as a team, and we put those accommodations in place. So we talked a little bit about accommodations, but there's also something called modifications, and those are actual changes to the curriculum expectations in order to meet the needs of the student. So it's changes in what the student is expected to learn and demonstrate in that content area. So this is made when the expectations of the regular general curriculum are beyond the student's level of ability. So for instance, maybe math will be altered to be a lower level math, something like that. It's going to alter the standard of what the test or assignment is supposed to measure, and may be minimal or very complex depending on the student's performance. So again, all of this is going to be individualized based on that particular student's needs, and it's going to be clearly acknowledged in the IEP. So you want to be really careful that you talk through that with the entire IEP team about what these modifications are going to be. The accommodations are a little bit easier, but modifications, you're really adjusting that in curriculum. And so you want to make sure that everybody's absolutely on the same page about everything. So here's a chart that talks about the difference between accommodations and modifications that you may want to refer to later as you do your readings and assignments. So again, it's either the grading is the same or the grading is different. It talks about the types of changes that are made to that curriculum in order for that student to have that access. And if it's changing it fundamentally, or if it's just talking about how that student is actually accessing that information. So there's more differences. Accommodations focus on removing the barriers to providing access to that curriculum. And again, it can be for students with disabilities, or any other student as well can benefit from these accommodations. So it's really like looking at each student and what their individualized needs are. I mean, every student learns in a very different way. Some are more visual learners, things like that. It's really just about removing any barriers that are getting in the way of that student accessing the curriculum that they need to in order to be with their peers. Whereas modifications are focusing on, making sure they're having meaningful participation in the general curriculum, but that might look very different. So they might be working on math, but they're working on different math, things like that. So I like to think of it as, when you're running. So, runners may have these hurdles and other things that are in their way, but really for students with disabilities, what we're talking about for all of this is removing those hurdles. So it might look different for each person. So for instance, for one, if you're doing a race, one student might need one of their peers to actually push their wheelchair across the board, finish line. Some may just need some might need a cane to get across if they're visually impaired. Some might just need a buddy to be with them in order. Some may just need some more encouragement. Some may need to walk instead of run. It just is going to look very different. And so that's kind of a good analogy and something to think about when you're thinking about, well, what does this all mean? And to make sure that every student has access to the content and curriculum. So accommodations are, again, leveling that playing field, making sure that every student is able to cross that finish line in a race. Every student is able to access that information in the classroom in order to meet their goals. And there's some examples here. Again, accommodations do not change knowledge or content. Modifications, however, do. Here's some examples of modifications. And modifications do change knowledge, content, and or the standard. So they might be learning something different than their peers. Similar but different. So who's responsible for all of this? So an accommodations is the how of the curriculum. A modification is what of the curriculum. So both the gen ed teacher and the special education teacher are responsible for making sure that the accommodations and modifications are appropriate and are put in place. And it's really the whole entire IEP team. So the parents are also involved in making sure that, because you're all getting feedback from the student too about what's working and not working in the classroom as far as those accommodations and modifications goes. And again, like I said, it's a very individualized process. And so you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from the parents, the entire family, the student, to make sure that you're putting those accommodations and modifications in place that really are meaningful for that particular student. It's very much a collaborative effort. Modifications, for the most part, are going to be for students who would have been traditionally pulled out into a separate program. So, a resource room or a specialized classroom. So modifications are going to provide them access to that general education classroom with their peers in that least restrictive environment. It might be for students who may have a low incidence disability, like a hearing loss, vision loss, something like that. Students for whom accommodations have been implemented to the fullest extent and they're still having difficulty. So you might try accommodations first and see if they can make that work. And if not, then maybe you adjust the curriculum just so that they can keep up with their peers and be successful with their individual goals for the year. So it's important to remember that the IEP or 504 team is going to determine how the student will participate, not whether the student will participate. So they're gonna talk about as a team with the parents and family on like what's that going to look like in the classroom. So what's that going to look like in the gen ed classroom, and is that student going to be educated in that gen ed classroom 100% of the time or part of the time? But when they're in the gen ed classroom, what is that going to look like? So in regards to that, those accommodations and modifications. So some frequently asked questions, who determines them? Again, it's that IEP team that's going to determine them in collaboration with the general and special educator, parents, student, and obviously the school district. Who gets the accommodations and modifications? Accommodations can be for any student, like I said. And for modifications is going to be a student who has an IEP and needs that. And do you need to accommodate? Yeah, absolutely. If a student has an IEP or a 504 plan that specifically states what those accommodations are going to be, those accommodations must be provided for that student because it's part of that plan in order to make that student successful in the classroom. If the student doesn't have an IEP or 504 plan, you aren't required to accommodate, but it is something that, most teachers, it's best practice to do that. Again, it's really just having that ability to really look at what the needs are of the students in the classroom and trying to make that every student successful. And sometimes I know I've seen it written that, what do I say when the students say, well, it's not fair that, my peer only has to do every other question on the homework assignment and can type their homework and not handwrite it. And fair means that everyone needs to get what they need in order to get it to be successful. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the same or equal, but what does that particular person need in order to be successful? And that's what's fair. So y'all want to get to the end and get to the end result and what's best for that particular person. Accommodations and modifications are most often made in the following areas. That's scheduling timing, like how long does somebody have to do a test. Settings, it can be an acquired environment, the type of materials, braille, typing, that kind of thing. A large print, for instance. Instruction, are the instructions going to be spoken orally instead of written? Student responses, is that student going to be able to talk about, are they going to be tested and be able to say what their knowledge is out loud instead of written down? In presentation, so if a student has a really hard time typing a big long, if they have learning disability, for instance, and they have a hard time putting together a big essay, can they do a PowerPoint or some other mechanism that's easier for them to show their content knowledge in that particular area? So I'm not going to go through all of this detail, but it's a really good, I'm going to have the PowerPoint slides up there for you guys. So these are some types of curriculum adaptations that can, some examples for you guys to look at later as you kind of go through the module. And putting it all together. So this is why is this important? It's to remove those barriers to learning and so that students can develop mastery just like their peers. Accommodations are going to keep those standards substantially the same for everyone, but the outcomes may look different. Modifications, on the other hand, may fundamentally change the standards, and the content level may vary from their peers. But the thing to remember is that the expectations remain high for all students. So we want to make sure that every student is being educated at the highest extent possible that they possibly can in order to meet their particular goals. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the module this week. If you have any questions at all about accommodations and modifications, feel free to shoot me an email or post something on the discussion board and I'd be happy to discuss it. Thank you. Have a good week.